Explain like I'm 5 what happens to the areas where nuclear bombs are tested. Most were cleaned up. The Trinity site can be visited a few times a year. I've been there. Other testing sites were Algeria, Australia, and South Pacific Marshall Islands, French Polynesia. The radioactive debris from Bikini Atoll tests were cleaned up and placed under a concrete dome. GPS 11.552720. 162.347114. From the 1960s or so they were all tested in tunnels deep underground. After the fact, the short-lived radiation decays over the course of months to years, but the site will maintain elevated but not dangerous levels of radiation compared to normal background. Most of the locations are still under guard and not open to the public at all times. However, it is possible to visit some of these sites in the States on specific days or through a guided tour. They get blown the F up. X200b. Other than that, the rocks literally melt and form a kind of glass. The place is a bit radioactive, but most of it goes away quite quickly. But they remain radioactive for a while. The Trinity site, for instance, was opened for tours back already in '53. But right now the radiation in the area is still 10x larger than background. When was the most recent nuke set off? Ever seen the documentary show SpongeBob? That takes place in Bikini Bottom, which is part of the Bikini Atoll, former site of atomic weapons testing. Seriously though, many sites stay radioactive and uninhabited. People and animals are affected. And eventually it dissipates. Atomic weapons have less radioactive material than, say, Chernobyl. That's why people live and thrive in Hiroshima today. I assume you're mostly referring to radiation. An atomic weapon uses nuclear power to detonate a bomb for its energy, not for its radioactive effect on the area. And nuclear energy is extraordinarily efficient. But the radioactive effects are still there for at least a short time. The tests done in New Mexico still had nearby residents go to the sites after the bomb tests and got exposed to a lot of radiation. The government didn't even bother to tell him to stay away for a while. It melts the sand into an element called trinitite, named for the Trinity site. My husband visited there on a work trip, and the person conducting the tour made a big display of saying that it was absolutely prohibited to take any of the glass formed by the blast. And now he would turn away for approximately 30 seconds while the visitors had a chance to appreciate the surroundings. And no, we don't have any trinitite in our home. It depends. If they detonated it high enough that the fireball didn't touch the ground. Not very much. The area would be safe again in a few days. If they tested it underground. Again, not very much. If it was a ground burst, it could take 5-10 years for the area to be safe again. But after that, the radiation level wouldn't really be any higher than the normal amount you get from just living on Earth. So in short, except for damage to the terrain, not much. The areas where nukes were tested are all safe to visit now. For the most part, they remain vacant. I have a friend that studied in nuclear chemistry back when we were in school. He got a university job where he was basically a researcher. He'd go out in the Washington Desert Old Hanford site. On a given day, he might drive out and look for rabbit poop. He'd test it for radioactivity and log and compare results to show where levels were. I read a biography of a couple who lived a normal life out west. One of their hobbies in the 60s was using the Geiger counter to find any rocks that clicked and storing them under their home in case they became valuable someday. There are still sites where the people who lived there can't return. They tried to get compensation but got only a little bit. So the US, UK and France destroyed the home of thousands of did not take any responsibilities for it. I live 50 miles from where 1,000 tests went off after WW2. We basically nuked ourselves more than the nukes we have on hand. Long-term effects so far have been thyroid problems. Trigger warning: reading too many answers can boil your emotions up to a point where you'd want to launch nuclear bombs on the houses of every soulless scum that is involved in making them. Personally, I'm ashamed of every continent. The two biggest ones, USA and Russia, are like exact twins. One is a mirror of the other. Extremely high levels of brain damage in their governments and citizens probably come from detonating and inhaling their own bombs too much. One test in Bikini Atoll after WW2 was so close to Japan. Southern parts of Hokkaido were affected. People injured. Americans included. Brilliant. Good one. Thanks, Oppie. The Soviets did their share too. It's not good. It gets blown up. Is that 5 years enough for you? Outside In from NHPR did an excellent episode interviewing people who have been affected by US nuclear tests. Long story short, it releases a bunch of carcinogenic radioactive material that can spread far and wide and affect people for a long time. Semi-test site has zone of radioactive contamination. Outer side has level of contamination here and there radioactive land patches, and inner side is more radioactive. The contaminated land must be frequently digged up and mixed with less contaminated zone to lower background radiation level. Soviets didn't tell locals that they were testing nuclear weapons. Later people started to have health issues. Kazakhstan is still paying pension to citizens who were affected by radiation of test site. While it isn't the actual test sites, my mother and her family were downwinders during the phase of the above-ground testing. Many of her siblings suffered from the cancers listed as compensated diseases under the Radiation Exposure Compensation Program. Radiation from nuclear bombs does not equal fallout from nuclear plant. Nuclear bombs burn through a lot of energy extremely fast, since heat increases the odds of fission occurring due to particles moving faster. Nuclear bombs will generally have waste further along in the decay cycle, purely due to the fact that the earlier decay elements have a really high chance of also being hit by a stray neutron. Being further along in the decay cycle, the fallout reaches somewhat stable elements far quicker than the fallout from Chernobyl, for example, will.